Hi, my name is Paul-Olivier Dehaye. I'm a member of the association Personal Data IO that is based in Geneva. I've been invited by Cédrine Morlière, the head of the Belgian Data Protection Authority, to testify at an event at the Belgian Parliament on smart cities. I testified on March 1st, 2024, but due to some kind of difficulties, the video wasn't properly recorded or there was some other reason, but in any case, I'm re-recording this video so that it can be shown to a wider audience. The topic of my intervention is about Uber drivers and Uber in general in the city of Geneva and some efforts we've made around the idea of drivers recovering their data and being empowered in relation to this. So I'll break down my intervention in 6 steps. In the first one, I'll present who we are. In the second one, what we know how to do, and the experience we've had. In the third step, why Uber matters as a subject of intervention in relation to data politics. Then I'll briefly present the context in Geneva, the particular context in Geneva around the beginning of 2023, what we actually did, and then I'll offer some suggestions for next steps. So who we are. Personal Data IO is a nonprofit, a public interest nonprofit, focused on making individual data rights actionable and collectively useful. So we want to encourage people to exercise their rights, their data rights, because if they don't, those rights will be lost. This has happened in the past, but with GDPR, the new the European Data Protection Regulation, new in 2018, we have a whole palette of rights, and we want to make sure that those are really effective. And we want to also make them collectively useful, so we have a collective perspective on personal data, and you will see some example of that here. So it's a very small nonprofit. It's essentially 5 volunteers who are more heavily involved. We're specialists in data, law, sociology, mathematics, and digital mediation. Myself, Paul-Olivier Dehaye, I'm a member of the association, also initially the founder, and I'm also a director of Estia.ai. This is a private company that is working on similar topics and has also been involved in some of what I will show here. So what do we know? Well, what we know is a lot about where our personal data is. Our personal data, as you might know, is being extracted all over the place, travels in entire data ecosystems. And what we spend our time doing is sort of mapping where this data goes. So we've built a website called digipower.academy. Academy is the top level domain. And in that website, we sort of explain the kind of things that we discover. So if you go there, you'll see a whole bunch of different apps that you know, like Fitbit, Netflix, LinkedIn, Google Takeout, Uber as a customer, but also, and we'll get to that in a second, Uber as a driver. And if you select one of those apps, or often you will see that you can either, well, on all of them, you can upload a data sample, and we give you instruction on how to recover your own data. So you can upload your own data there to visualize it, but there are also data samples. So let me show you what that looks like for Google Takeout in particular. So here we have taken some sample data from Google that Google has collected about a test phone that we have. And we upload it into our tool, and then we're able to see what kind of geographic data, if you want, Google has collected. So here you see Ouchy, which is an area in Lausanne in Switzerland. And you see that Google thinks that with 73%, that phone was located at Lausanne-Ouchy. But also with 3.16%, the user was actually located nearby at Place de la Navigation 1A, which is a searched address, an address that the user has searched in the past. So this is really to show you the type of data that Google collects about users on Android. And this data is collected, among other things, is inferred from all kind of Wi-Fi routers that your phone will hear, your Android phone, or even your iOS phone will hear when you move around. So it hears all kinds of routers that are around that are broadcasting, hey, I'm here, you can connect if you want. Your phone is not responding to that, but your phone is hearing that information, will log it, and will send it to Google. And then when we exercise our rights, when we get a copy of this data, we get a copy of this data that Google has collected. Now, it's really important to know that such data sets exist. First of all, because it helps you better understand as a citizen the digital landscape around you, but also as a person who is in charge of implementing smart cities, this broad concept, and who potentially is trying to anonymize data or to reduce the risks associated to data. It's quite important to know that such data sets actually exist and basically make it really, really hard to fully anonymize data sets in relation to some actors like Google who have such data. Most of the time, actually, it makes it almost impossible. Now, my main point is that knowing that such a data set exists already limits what smart city planners can do because they have to take into account all kinds of threats, of privacy threats that do exist, including, for instance, Google. Now, the subject of my talk, my intervention today, is about really Uber. And Uber matters in the context of a smart city, obviously, but it matters in particular because we all share public space, so privacy is important. That is a common concern for a lot of smart city projects, but it's not the only concern. More broadly, the concern is control and power. And that control and power will certainly manifest itself when people travel around the city and as pure citizens, they are worried that they would be observed. But if the city is really their space of work, that really affects them significantly, that data would be collected whenever they move around. So Uber is really here an example of algorithmic control that in the context of employment, but that algorithmic control is very interesting because it rhymes with global issues tied to employment, tied to pollution also, that is inherent to Uber's business model of always having drivers roaming around the city ready to pick any passenger who might open up the app. But it also has potentially local solutions because this is, after all, Uber is really a sum of many small cities where it might be easier to figure out how to deal with such problems if only there was some transparency about what Uber actually does. So this is kind of the theory or the perspective that we wanted to deploy in Geneva in a particular context in 2023. So let me spell that out for you. So in so last year, or actually the year before, there was a judgment from the highest Swiss court that Uber drivers were actually employees. So for the past 5 years, the judgment says that they were actually employees, and that means that they have some rights to all of their car expenses being paid for 5 years, their holiday, their sick pay, their overtime, and due to recent decisions in Geneva, also a minimum wage. So the big question then is, how do we quantify how much that is worth? At the time, there was some discussion between the Canton of Geneva and Uber to figure out a deal to retrospectively address this. Some kind of deal that was offered to the driver. The drivers could just sign, get some money, and then we would move on to other things. That was essentially the idea. And there was a lot of time pressure on drivers to accept the deal. But the drivers essentially had to accept blind because they didn't really know how to quantify how much money was owed to them, again, due to car expenses, holiday and sick pay, and overtime. So what we actually did, coming with our expertise, was to say that, well, data protection is there to address issues of control and power, and the right of access gives you, Uber driver, access to your personal data. So in theory, you should just be able to ask Uber for your data, you get it, and then we will interpret the data collected around your work, around the work of those drivers, as personal data informing what should be owed to them. A sort of like factory punch card 2.0. So we really helped the drivers exercise their right of access That was the very first step. So here you can see different employees of Estia and volunteers helping the drivers. So on the right, this is in Geneva, where in the center there is a data scientist that starts helping the drivers analyze their data, while all the drivers around are starting to ask questions about this data. And on the left, you can see a similar effort, but in Paris, that was immediately replicated from Geneva because the Parisian drivers wanted to do the same thing. So what kind of data are we talking about? Well, here you can see a little sample. You can see in red and in blue and yellow, you can see different paths as the crow flies, as we say, so straight lines joining a pickup point and a drop-off point, or a drop-off point and then a new pickup point, and so on and so on, or a request point and a pickup point. And then the little dots in orange are geolocation data. So you can see that you can pretty granularly trace the paths of drivers. These geolocation points tend to come with like a 3-second interval. So it's quite precise, quite accurate to trace the exact path followed by drivers. So what we did is that we tried to help the drivers understand this data, what the potential was for this data to help them. And here you can see again the tool DigiPower Academy to visualize those rides within Geneva, with some information at the bottom on the fare that they received for these rides. And so once they understood that this data could actually help them document everything, we helped them recover this data. It was extremely difficult. There were many obstacles, mostly on Uber's side, at recuperating this data. This was not the first time we had tried doing this with Uber drivers. In fact, we've been trying to do that for years. And whenever it doesn't work, we file complaints, or we make sure that the drivers have the legal assistance they need to file complaints. And recently, there was a judgment on a 3-year-old case coming from French drivers in the Netherlands. There was a decision by the Dutch Data Protection Authority that imposed a 10 million euro fine against Uber. So the Netherlands Data Protection Authority is relevant because Uber is based in the Netherlands. And so with the one-stop shop mechanism, it's the Dutch Data Protection Authority that essentially is the lead authority on those matters. So it's not like we didn't have any problem, any difficulty getting back the data. We had a lot of difficulties, so many that it's hard not to think that this is actually intentional. Despite this recent judgment and previous judgments, we keep on encountering difficulties with Uber for recovering the data of drivers. Some reasons that are offered by Uber are completely ludicrous, and clearly so, but still, we did recover some data. So you can see a glimpse of the process we followed here with those 6 phones of Uber drivers. This was just the very first step, because we had to go through like the easy step that Uber puts in place, which doesn't give all the data that the drivers actually need, but does give a confirmation that they've requested the data at a certain date. So we help them do that, and then we help them to file bigger and bigger requests as they got some data. Clearly, extremely cumbersome steps, no reason for it to be so difficult, but eventually we did get some data. And this is actually what we computed with it. It's very basic, it's just Excel files. Excel files that document how much Uber paid them, how much distance they've traveled, either as the crow flies or as recovered using OpenStreetMap, the time it took, and all of this broken down according to different criteria, for instance, at night, on the weekends, and so on and so on. With a passenger, fetching a passenger, waiting for a client, and so on and so on. In the end, we found huge discrepancies with the offers of Uber. Typically, the offers that Uber was making to the drivers were on the order of like 4,000 Swiss francs, so around 4,000 euros. The amounts that we were calculating that Uber drivers were due were easily in the tens of thousands, very, very easily, if not hundreds of thousands for some drivers. One has to take into account that those drivers are working easy 350 days a year for some of them, um, full days, like 11, 12 hours. So it's a huge amount of time that they work. And if you apply the law strictly, that is the amount you get to. Now, I say we computed. We were careful as an association focused on data to actually just do the accounting of hours, of distance, the things that were more objective. But we also worked with lawyers, the lawyers of the drivers, to make sure that this data was useful for them to make estimates. So any estimate of the amount of money the drivers were owed, it's actually that estimate was actually done by lawyers, by experts in labor laws that were relying on our timesheet, if you want, on our advanced timesheets. We also computed dashboards, more forward-looking dashboards, or more dashboards that were more looking at influencing the work of drivers in the future. So what we were trying to calculate there was the revenue of the drivers with different ways of breaking it down, depending on the time of the day of the week, different sorts of calculations. So for instance, the revenue per hour, like we would be used to computing, but also the revenue per kilometer, which was a very important statistics for the drivers. Now, that is all well and good, but it's really, in our view, just a first step, because there's a lot more that we could do. So we were already able to reverse engineer a lot of Uber's routing algorithms. It turns out that it's actually not that smart, at least in Geneva. It's mostly based on OpenStreetMap data. I mean, or we covered much of the same routing predictions or routing decisions as OpenStreetMap data, even though that OpenStreetMap data does not include any notion of traffic. It's going to be the same distance, the same time, whatever the traffic is, whatever the time of the day is, and so on and so on. So if you just take that dumb data, that dead data in a sense, you already recover 99% of the predictions that Uber makes. Now, all of these efforts clearly should be replicated in other countries, in other cities. This is actually already started. There's a whole bunch of initiatives that are springing up that are trying to replicate the example that we have set in Geneva. But this is just an example of what could be done collectively around data. There are many more issues to explore. For instance, consumer protection. Uber is not always making the same promises or fully truthful promises to consumers, or promises to consumers that are completely in accordance with the promises made to drivers. In particular, in some cities, Uber is taking not only a cut on the price that the driver will receive, but also a spread, because it's declaring different amounts to the driver and the passenger. So it's kind of double dipping on that relationship. Having more transparency on both sides from both sides would be very interesting. This data is also collectively interesting for mobility questions. I mean, in Geneva, we only helped close to 50 drivers recover their data. That doesn't sound like very much. Geneva is not very big, but also these were the drivers that were most involved in Uber because they had most at stake in terms of recovering money. And the consequence is that we estimate we have between 5 and 10% of the Uber traffic for that 5-year period. So it's not negligible. It starts to have some statistical significance. And we can study, for instance, we could study the evolution of traffic, of mobility in Geneva over time. This is also, and very interestingly to me, just an entry point into similar practices, not just around mobility or gig work, but in general, around artificial intelligence systems. The way I see those artificial intelligence systems, generative AI, is about paths of thoughts, different ways of thinking, different ways of having your thought or those models' thoughts travel into different flows of thinking. And here we also have different ways of traveling in a city, and we're applying artificial intelligence to it. So the example of Uber driver is a very good pedagogical example on how to think about algorithms applying on a space of potential paths. In the end, it's clear that transparency is very important all over the place in this data economy, and we hope to have shown this with this example of Uber. So thank you very much. I hope you have enjoyed this little redo of my presentation at the Belgian Parliament, and I can be contacted at the address listed below. This is clearly the work of many people involved both in the association and company, Estia.ai. In no way did I mean to imply that this was only my personal work. Very many people were involved. Thank you.